Hi everyone, Beau Liddell here of Images by Beaulin. Welcome to part 2 of my video series on exposure blending. Before I show today's first blending example, just a quick reminder that I'm not going to be covering any of the automated high dynamic range, focus stacking, or stitch panorama techniques, or the software that is used to conduct those techniques during these videos. While those technically are forms of digital blending, there's little involved since you simply load some images into the application, select or click a command, and there's not much more to it than that. Furthermore, those automated techniques are really well covered elsewhere, included in all the Photoshop textbooks that are out on the market. Now, another reason why I specifically won't be covering automated HDR processing is that I firmly believe, through experience, mind you, that it provides an inferior result from an image quality standpoint compared to the results that you can achieve by manually blending your photos in Photoshop. I also won't be covering what layers are and how to manage them. You really do need to understand how to use a layered workflow, how to create, delete, group, apply blend modes and styles to your layers, as well as change their opacities. I also won't be covering basic image adjustment layers, such as, say, levels or curves, to name a couple. I won't be covering the basics of layer masking and using selection tools, nor arguably one of the most important skills to achieve in Photoshop is knowing what the brush tool is and how to use it to apply image adjustments and masks. These are all crucial tools or skills that I call Photoshop essentials, and you should already have some familiarity with them. If you don't, you might want to brush up on those essentials before trying to blend any images yourself. Now, the last thing I'm not going to provide detailed steps on in these videos is how to create luminosity selections and masks. That's not because I won't be applying them or demonstrating some ways in which they can be used in my examples, but the steps from scratch are fairly involved. There's an awful lot behind the whole theory of applying these luminosity masks towards your image blending workflow, and we just don't have time to do them justice here. But luminosity selections on masks are very powerful processing tools, and I suggest you learn how to use them since they're going to open up completely new horizons for your photography and take it to the next level. If interested, you can visit photographer Tony Kuiper's website at Goodlight US for basic web-based written tutorials on how to create and use luminosity masks, as well as the links on his website to purchase and download his Photoshop actions, as well as the very excellent video tutorials that are on the subject by photographer Sean Bagshaw. So with that, let's get started. Okay, here's a couple photos I ported into Photoshop from my Lightroom catalog. At this stage, back up a minute and point out that for this video and future videos, you'll notice keyboard shortcuts showing up at the bottom of the screen that'll help you follow along. A couple keyboard shortcuts that will be used throughout these video tutorials include the Shift key noted here, the Option key on a Mac, also Alt on a PC, the Command key on a Mac, or Control key on a PC. All right, so what I'm going to demonstrate in this particular video are very basic layer masking techniques that can be used to blend multiple images together. And I find that they are very powerful, and in many cases they can generate as good or superior results to pretty much any other blending technique. There are cases where they're not going to get the job done, but at least 90% of the time I find that manual layer masking will do the trick. But of course it all depends on your image. Now in this particular shot I'm demonstrating starbursts. And a common analog that I don't take many night cityscapes, but many of you might. And you might want to generate starbursts, but there's a couple different steps to a final output of utmost image quality. Usually it involves taking two shots. One at a lower f-stop number, which means a larger aperture, which maximizes image quality because it won't suffer the softening effects of diffraction as much. And then to take a second shot at a smaller aperture, which would be a higher f-stop number, that'll generate the starburst. The tact or technique then is to blend in the image with starburst with the higher pixel quality image that was taken at a larger f-stop. Okay, so how I'll go about doing that in this case would be to apply a layer mask. And this layer mask is filled with white. There's a phrase that says, white reveals and black conceals. So the white in this case is revealing everything on this particular image. This is the image that was taken at f22. The underlying layer was taken at f-stop of 8. And if I invert that mask, I've now filled it with black and hidden that layer and revealed the layer underneath. So I'm going to take my brush tool here, set to white, and I've got a fairly large brush, and I'm just going to start either dab or brush in one of those starbursts. That's one way in which I can do this in this case. Here's what that layer mask looks like. But there's another way I can do a general manual layer mask to blend this image. If I zoom into another one of the starbursts, reduce my brush size, I can be as intricate as I want. And it really all depends upon what your goals are, how much time you have. In this case, I can retain the rays from the previous image. Gives a little extra texture to these starbursts, or I can mask them out. And in this case, I'm being very precise so that the best pixel from the lower layer are showing through most of the image. And so I can go around this entire light and mask in this starburst, or mask out part of the rays from the underlying image. So you get the idea at any rate. So this is one example of very simple layer mask to blend an image, and we're just masking in certain portions of an image and masking out certain portions of another. Not terribly complicated. Another example where we use a similar technique is when we have a landmark or a favorite tourist destination and you want to mask out tourists. Here I've got two different shots, and it's very easy to mask out this particular, the parts of the image that I want masked out. I'll just zoom in here, adjust my brush size, make sure I've got it to black because I want to hide this. And now I have successfully masked out that distracting element from that layer using this layer here. And I have a final image that's ready for processing to generate it for final output and or reproduction. And that's the goal for blending, for digital blending, is whatever the steps are required to blend one image with another, and if you create some artifacts in the process that I'll talk about in the next image, you want to correct some of those artifacts at some point, and that's all part of digital blending. But the goal is to generate that baseline image that's ready for the additional final processing steps. Oh, another common example where you can use a very simple mask to achieve your results is taking photographs of waterfalls. And in this case, we have a photo. This is a 7-image vertical stitched panorama of Pigeon Falls up in Grand Portage State Park in northeastern Minnesota. Very windy day, 30-mile-an-hour winds. I needed fast shutter speeds to be able to freeze the action and keep the vegetation and surrounding landscape in focus. And regardless, it's very difficult even under overcast days to get the long shutter speeds you might want to achieve that silky flowing white hair effect, as I call it, for water, such as in this shot. And so typically what you'll do is deploy filters like a neutral density filter, like I did here, a 5-stop filter. And I was able to achieve the long shutters of 5 seconds that I needed. In doing so, though, I blurred all of the vegetation in the surrounding landscape, and a notorious problem with all neutral density filters is it does generate a color cast, very slight, oftentimes cool, sometimes a little warm. It just all depends on the filter that you're using, but the best of them will generate that problem. And so at any rate, what I want to do is mask in the water in this shot with the surrounding landscape and the rocks on this shot. Again, very simple. I'll simply use a layer mask and a brush of appropriate size. Here I'm going to invert that mask, and then I can begin painting in the waterfall. And it really doesn't take much time. If you don't have a tremendously, really complicated couple of images to blend together, this doesn't take but a few seconds to a few minutes. So you get the idea here. What I'm going to do is go to my channels palette, and I'm going to load a channel mask that I had previously created, apply that to create a mask on this waterfall. So here, waterfall, and so here is that final blend. And you'll notice, because of the filter that was used in one of the exposures, and you'll also find that if you have different exposure values for the photos that you're blending together, that once you create the blend using manual techniques, is you'll have some of these artifacts, such as on this image, this color balance in the areas, particularly the dark areas within the mask. Here there's a line on the right and left edges of these two masks. So that color balance is showing through differently because it was different in that top layer. Similarly, if I was lightening or darkening an image using the top layer and the bottom layer is of a different exposure value, I could have light or dark edge effects that need correcting. So I will be demonstrating how to correct a lot of those burned edges that are created when masking a darker image, say a darker sky on top of a lighter foreground. And I'll do that in the next video part, but just to wet our whistle here and to pique your interest, I'm going to correct this particular color balance error. I've already created a color balance correction, and I've got a previous mask that I'm going to go ahead and load here from the channels palette, apply that, and you can see that I've now corrected that color balance. And I've just done that using a standard layer masking technique on top of that adjustment layer. And so I can go in and alter that if I need to, if I think I went too far or didn't cover enough. And so at any rate, for the most part, I have a pretty good image here that's ready for the additional processing steps to generate for output or reproduction. Okay, so let's look at another image here, and again I can use these same processes. This is a photograph of Mount Rainier from Tipsoo Lake. Make sure my brush tool is selected, and I'm going to go ahead and, using black here on top of a white mask, I'm going to hide the top layer where I don't want it to show through and reveal the bottom layer. These were actually two images, or two imported versions of the same photo, where I processed the photo twice in Lightroom, one for the sky and one for the foreground. And I did that because I actually get a better blend result, because I can better control the highlights and midtones when I do that. And you can see here that as I get to the edge of the ridge line, or my horizon if you want to call that, accepting the volcano. I'm paying a little more attention so that I don't go too far down onto that ridge line. And as I hit that ridge line, you notice I'm starting to burn it. It's just a term for darkening it. And I'm darkening it more than I probably want to. If I look at that bottom layer, you can see that there's a natural shadow on that horizon. But it's a little bit too far in this image, a little too dark. And so again, I've created that artifact that needs correcting. But it's easy to correct. Again, I'll deal with that in the next video part. But again, I wanted to demonstrate how quickly I can mask in these two images. And I'm just quickly going to look at my mask and make sure that I haven't left anything untouched that I don't want untouched. Okay, so let's delete that layer mask. Another way that I can mask in these two images is by using a gradient mask. In this case, I've got it set from black to white. If I use my X key, I can change that from white to black, depending upon your image, and whether you have your light or dark image on top will dictate the transition that you want to use. In this case, I want to go from black to white from the top down. So I've selected my gradient tool, and where I press that tool down and start from there and above, it's going to achieve the full effect, 100% opacity, blending in that lower layer and hiding the upper layer. And then from where I begin drawing that line to where I end drawing that line is where the transition of the gradient from, in this case, black to white is going to occur. The shorter that line, the harder and shorter that transition, and the more obvious that transition is going to be. The longer the line, the more gentle that blend is going to be. So for this particular example, I'm going to start it right about here. I'm going to shift or hold down my shift key. That'll prevent me from drawing an angled line. So I'm going to draw a straight line, straight down, vertical, and go about maybe that far. Release both the mouse, or in this case the pen I'm using on the tablet, and the shift key, and here I get my blend. And it's very similar to the blend that we got using the manual brushing techniques. And then if I wanted to, I could go to my brush and just make sure that a couple of these areas that didn't get blended in the mountain and on the sky, like right there, that I fully blend in that sky and the highlights in the mountain that I want. Okay, so just a couple different ways that I can achieve essentially the same results. And depending upon what you're more comfortable with and what may work quicker for you will dictate what method you use. Okay, so I showed this example in part 1 of this tutorial series, and this is a focus stack. And you can see here on the right that I have 12 photos. 11 were taken at the same exposure value or equivalency, and that's this focus stack that's showing here with all the layer masks applied. 2 of the shots were taken on infinity. The rest were focused at different focus distances. And then those similarly exposed shots were merged using the photo stacking process. I'm going to merge those layers down to 1 and show you the bottom layer, which is the photo that was optimized for the sky and the mountain. So again, we're going to blend these together, choose my brush tool, and I'm going to keep it at black. I'm going to bring my brush size down a little bit, and incidentally, I always use a relatively soft brush whenever I can. That'll make blends much more natural. And I'm going to simply blend this in. I'm going to make sure I get the sky fully blended in because it has such a nice blue tone, and then the alpenglow on the mountain, I want that fully revealed. And then as I approach this shadow line, I'm actually going to go over in this case. I slightly overexposed and open the shadows in the valley so that I have good image quality, but it's a little bit too light. So I'm going to increase my brush size just a little bit. I'm going to go back here to our medium gray, light gray, and then just darken that ever so slightly. That's a little more natural. Okay, now in the process, you can see again, as we generated in the previous couple of images, a little bit of edge burning right here, maybe right here on the edge of the shadow line, up on this ridge line, and just ever so slightly here on those pines. And we can very easily recover that in with an additional correction step. Okay, and we'll deal with that in the next video. Again, I can apply my gradient tool if I want, and I'm going to do that by starting my gradient right about here, dragging down, releasing, and there's my blend. And I went a little bit further than I did with the manual blend here. So again, I burned pretty good right here and here. Again, we can easily correct that. So just another example, but a good example of where you need to apply these kinds of techniques to focus stacks, because when you have multiple exposures between sky and foreground, the focus stack cannot handle it. So it requires this manual blending. Okay, now another final example that I'm going to show you is this one right here. And before I finish that, let's go ahead and quit preview. All right, so panoramas are very easy to create these days, and there's automated processes within Photoshop as well as dedicated panorama stitching programs. There is a problem, however, in that there are examples where even when you use all the correct steps and do everything correctly, you will not be able to get the programs to stitch the photos because there'll be too much distortion. I'm using a very wide angle lens here, a 14mm ultra wide angle. The field of view in this particular shot, Milky Way shot at Mount Rainier, the bottom of this shot is literally just in front of my toes. The top of this layer is almost straight overhead. And because I'm using that 14mm lens, there's difference in magnification. So what you have to do is expand your canvas and then take one of the images and warp it to get it to size a little more consistently and match up with the other image. And it'll never be perfect. I've done that here with this lower layer. And what I tried to do was to line up the curvature here on the slope and the edge of the meadow towards the river valley there with the other shot, and to somewhat line up the mountain as close as I possibly could. Again, it doesn't have to be exact because I'm not going to reveal this portion of the image. I'm just going to reveal this trim line here on the meadow back towards the foreground. So I've already conducted the warp here, and now it's simply a function of using our standard layer masking techniques. So I want to hide the lower portion of this top layer. So grab my brush tool, make sure that it's black. I'm going to choose an appropriate size. I'm going to, let's see here, a little bit of operator here. Okay, we're going to zoom in so we can see what we're doing here a little bit better. Zoom in a little bit further yet so I can see that trim line real well. Now I'm just going to start masking in that lower image and masking out the top layer. You can see there's a lot of detail in that metal that I'm revealing now. And that lower shot, because this portion of the image was towards the center of the lens, I got a much better result than I did in the top layer. That's why I'm masking this in. And I'm also, because of the expansive field of view, I'm able to get portions of the scene that I couldn't get with that top layer. Now I went a little bit too far. I'm pretty much as far as I want to go. I'm going to click X to cycle back to white. Started revealing a little bit of this light pollution from the person that was walking down the path in that valley. All right, we've got that covered back up, and that looks like we're pretty good to go. So at this point, we pretty much have a finished image. I'm going to merge those layers down. I'm going to grab my crop tool. Here you can see how I warp the image to get it to line up at least a little bit with the top layer. Here's my crop. Could have done a slightly better job on that crop. We'll just leave that for now and correct that later. Okay, so we've created a very nice base layer with which now I can work to add different additional adjustments. Quite a few, in fact, are required for star photography processing, but we're ready for that final processing now. So I hope you've learned something. Just to recap, we've applied very basic layer masking techniques, including gradient layer masks and manually brushing in layer masks using a soft brush to blend multiple images together. So I hope you've learned something, and stay tuned for the next part in this video tutorial series, and we'll demonstrate how to correct some of the artifacts that are created and also demonstrate some other blending techniques. Thank you for watching. Cheers.